Good morning and welcome to this event, a partnership between the Religious Freedom Institute and the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. My name is Eric Patterson. I serve as president of the Religious Freedom Institute and as a research fellow at the Berkeley Center. And on behalf of our convener, Jose Casanova, and all the team, welcome. The mission of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs is to seek a more just and peaceful world by building knowledge and advancing cooperation through research, teaching, and dialogue. The mission of the Religious Freedom Institute is to advance a broad understanding of religious liberty as a fundamental human right, a source of individual and social flourishing, and as a driver of national and international security. Of course, the context of today's conversation is to look at the religious freedom dynamics and the religious identity dynamics in the situation in Ukraine following Russia's invasion last year. Let me note that there's been a state of war in this region for much longer than the last 12 months, beginning with Russian meddling and then the invasion of Crimea nearly a decade ago. So people on the ground have understood themselves to be in a state of war and of insecurity throughout the last 8 years. But our particular focus is the state of conflict and its ramifications for religious freedom over the past 12 months. Our distinguished speakers will raise a number of key issues, such as the vocal support of the Russian Orthodox Church hierarchy in Moscow for this invasion. We'll look at contrasts between Ukraine's unique religious denominationalism versus Russia's use of counterterrorism laws to bully and bludgeon religious minorities, and its use of a sort of Russian religious nationalism to justify this invasion. We'll look a bit at the complex situation between Ukraine's Orthodox churches, including the decision by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate to announce in May 2022 that it was officially severing ties with the Moscow Patriarchate. On the battlefield, we've seen some clergy detained and beaten. According to one US government report, more than 100 churches have been seriously damaged or destroyed as Russia indiscriminately targeted civilian areas. Typically, houses of worship are off limits in times of war. Both sides have claimed that priests have worked as political provocateurs. Kiev reports that some Russian Orthodox clergy within Ukraine actively provide information to Russian troops. Ukraine's government has actively sought to sanction senior Russian clergy. So we'll be looking at questions about how does a government draw the line on issues of loyalty? And where should clergy draw the line on their overlapping loyalties and commitments? Well, today we bring together a distinguished panel of experts to look at these issues. I'll briefly introduce the panel, and then we'll get right into it. Let me say a word about process. We welcome your questions and audience involvement, and we'll try to get to some of your questions. Please use the chat function. I'll moderate Q&A at various times over the next 2 hours. And when you send a question, please let us know your name and affiliation. My thanks to the technical crew at the Berkeley Center. We couldn't do this without their expertise. Let me briefly introduce our panelists today. Archbishop Boris Gudziak is the Archbishop Metropolitan of the Ukraine Catholic Archeparchy of Philadelphia and the president of the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, Ukraine, and he's joining us from Paris today. Following him will be Nadia Kidzenko, professor of Russian and East European history and director of the Religious Studies program at the University of Albany. Next, we'll hear from Kathy Warner, professor of history and anthropology at Pennsylvania State University. She'll be followed by Frank Sisson, director of the Peter Jasek Center for Ukrainian Historical Research at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies and professor of history and classics at the University of Alberta. And finally, our convener, Jose Casanova, senior fellow at the Berkeley Center and professor emeritus at Georgetown University. And with this, let me turn it over to the Archbishop to begin his remarks. Thank you.
Good afternoon, dear friends. I come to you from Paris, and I hope the internet holds out because there's been some difficulty. To answer the question directly, is there any danger for religious freedom in Ukraine? I would say yes. There is, every time there's a Russian aggression, historically over the last 3 centuries and over the last years. A Russian involvement, a Russian occupation leads to some kind of religious repression. Particularly, this is true for Ukrainian Catholics who, from the end of the 18th century through the 19th century, in the 20th and already in the 21st century, are outlawed always, sooner or later, by any Russian occupying regime, whether it's Tsarist, communist, or Putinist. But this pertains not only to the Ukrainian Catholics. Russian political domination means the elimination of free Ukrainian Orthodoxy that has taken different forms in different centuries, but we see the intolerance of Russia and the Russian Orthodox Church for a Ukrainian Orthodox self-determination. We know that many confessions are persecuted in Russia. Some are illegal, like the Jehovah's Witnesses. Many Protestant organizations and churches have no freedom in Russia. The Ukrainian Catholics probably have at least 500,000 faithful or children or grandchildren of faithful in Russia, but there's not a single legal registered Ukrainian Eastern Catholic parish in the entire federation. We know that Jews and Muslims also have incurred historically and in recent times persecution and marginalization. So this is the big factor. I think it needs to be remembered that in Russia we do not have full religious freedom. In Ukraine, there has been a very admirable expression of religious freedom and diversity. There's over 100 different confessions. They range the whole Christian spectrum. There's numerous Jewish and Muslim jurisdictions, and there are some other religions represented. The Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations, which represents 90% of the people of faith, has been a very admirable forum for discussion, not of dogmatic issues, but social questions. And it just most recently made an appearance in Rome, where it was welcomed by Pope Francis. It needs really to be clear at the beginning of this discussion, and for all academic, theological, and political discussion, debate, that the biggest threat to religious freedom in Ukraine is Russian occupation. And we've seen it happen with our own eyes in recent years, in recent months. We do have right now a situation where 2 Ukrainian Eastern Catholic Redemptorist monks about a month ago were kidnapped, arrested, and are enduring torture. There, of course, were the numerous Baptists that were killed at the beginning of this war, and a number of Orthodox priests have also perished during this war. So it is a deadly danger for religious confessions, and I think this needs to be remembered.
Sir, thank you very much. There was one question that I will raise to you just right now, if you can just briefly say something on it. Someone asked about the Orthodox tradition and providing a just war framework and a human rights framework. Could you briefly point them in the right direction if they wanted to find more resources about that?
Yeah, I'm not a great expert on Orthodox social doctrine. It is less developed, both in its medieval and tradition, in contemporary kind of articulation than Catholic social doctrine. But I think it echoes Catholic conviction that war is aggressive war is immoral. War is actually a combination of all the sins, everything that war is a total and complete negation of God's commandments of Holy Scripture. But that somebody who is defending the innocents, who is defending oneself, one's land, one's freedoms, one's dignity, has not only the right, but the responsibility to do so. Of course, there's, what makes something orthodox? If an Orthodox person says something, is that Orthodox teaching? In other words, if Patriarch Kirill is saying something, does that make it Orthodox theology? I think some of the things Patriarch Kirill has been saying is rather in symphony with jihadist language. So, you can have an Orthodox person that is really expressing Islamist, let's say, theological kind of delusion. But I think across the board, if you don't include kind of complete pacifist conviction, the Christian position is analogous. War is terrible. War is sin. Starting war is the greatest sin. But you are called to defend the innocent.
Thank you. Thank you. One resource that I usually point people to is 3 books from an Orthodox perspective by a former U.S. Army chaplain, which is Father Alexander Webster, who's a Russian Orthodox priest. We also have an interview with him from 1 year ago on our YouTube channel with the Religious Freedom Institute in talking about justified war. And he has some views that disagree with some of us on this panel, but it's very illuminating, and his books are extremely, extremely helpful. Well, with that, thank you, Archbishop, and we're going to move now to our next speaker. Over to you, Nadia.
Thank you. I very much appreciate that Archbishop Boris set the context. Indeed, the statements of Patriarch Kirill are evocative of the Crusades and the Crusaders more than they are of traditional Orthodox teaching. But I actually thought that we were here also to talk about, is religious freedom under threat in Ukraine? Because there's no question that it is in Russia. So if we ask, is religious freedom under threat in Ukraine? Maybe a more interesting question is, why now are we asking this question? Because we would not have asked the question in the same way half a year ago. And note, I am not saying on February 24th or since February 24th. We are asking now, not because of any new actions on Russia's part, but because of concrete actions recently taken by Ukrainian authorities. On the other hand, we could have asked this question already 3 years ago. Why? Because in 2019, a law was proposed to the Ukrainian parliament that a church which has its leadership in an aggressor state has to change its name to incorporate the full name of that leadership into its own name. That law, incidentally, was made soon after the creation of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and was obviously aimed to promote and foster the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. So this proposed law targeting the Ukrainian Orthodox Church would have compelled it to change its name to the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine or the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. The law was under consideration in the Ukrainian Constitutional Court until late 2022. The Constitutional Court found it legal on December the 28th. The proposed law reads, and I apologize because even for legal language, it is cumbersome, but here we go. I quote, religious organizations, associations that are part of the structure of, affiliated with, a religious organization, association, whose governing center, administration, is located outside Ukraine in a state that is recognized by law as having implemented military aggression against Ukraine to reflect their affiliation with a religious organization, association outside Ukraine, to which it is a member, by mandatory reproducing the full statutory name of such a religious organization. End quote. Yes, this is turgid, but that's the law we have, and that is the religious freedom issue at hand. Can the state rename religious institutions against their will? Now, even this webinar description refers to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church as the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, but that is not its name and never was. Its name is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So why is the Berkeley Center calling it something it does not call itself? In fact, who can decide what a church can call itself is not a trick question. It actually gets at the core of the issue. In teaching the religious history of Ukraine for over 25 years, I have always instructed students to refer to Ukrainian Greek Catholics and not Uniates, because those described regard the term Uniates as derogatory, and because they call themselves Greek Catholics. That is their name. It is not for outsiders to decide what their name should be. So is it for anyone outside the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to decide for it? Is it the role of a state? Is it the task of a state to intervene in a religion to the point of changing its name? The Ukrainian Constitutional Court has ruled that yes, such a law is constitutional. And this is rough if you are a good Democrat, because on the one hand, we have to respect the decision of democratically constituted courts, even if we may not like those decisions. On the other hand, we can and should criticize those decisions when they seem to be flawed. This applies in the United States, it applies in Poland, and it applies in Ukraine. So let us leave aside the matter of whether the Ukrainian Constitutional Court is apparently moving against religious freedom. Let us now consider the law on its own terms. Let's answer the question, does this law apply to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church? Does the Ukrainian Orthodox Church have its leadership in Russia? Or is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church independent? The Ukrainian Orthodox Church says it is no longer part of the Russian Orthodox Church or affiliated with it. So if the state says it is, it will have to prove it. I must say, the evidence we've seen so far do not seem convincing, but what might be the arguments that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is part of the Russian Orthodox Church? Argument number one, that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was, in fact, part of the Russian Orthodox Church, albeit with great autonomy. But after May 2022, a Ukrainian Orthodox Church Council declared that it was independent. Other than a nod to its history, its new statute does not mention either Russia or the Russian Orthodox Church. It behaves like an autocephalous church. Metropolitan Onufry celebrates liturgy as the head of an autocephalous church. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church has established parishes abroad with a bishop who is responsible for them, and they have reinstated the practice of making their own chrism. Argument number two, The Russian Orthodox Church continues to claim that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is a part of it, and it claims that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church's changes have been made under duress, under pressure from so-called Ukrainian fascists. Despite the Ukrainian Orthodox Church's rejecting this claim, the Russian Orthodox Church continues to list the Ukrainian Orthodox Church on its website. But if I claim that someone is my girlfriend, while she says, no, we split up a long time ago, I'm living on my own, I'm independent, who do we believe? The bullying ex or the person who is left? But more concretely, a few weeks ago, Russia demanded that religious persecution in Ukraine be discussed at the UN Security Council. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church immediately protested. I quote, "The Ukrainian Orthodox Church has not asked any state to assist in the protection of its rights, let alone the state that has committed the treacherous armed attack on our country. Nor did we authorize anyone from the Russian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, to speak on our behalf at the UN. We are concerned that the issue of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is being raised by organizations that have nothing to do with us. We call on the Russian authorities not to speak on behalf of our church on international platforms and not to use religion for their own political purposes." So clearly, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is drawing lines that show its independence. Argument number 3. There have been individual collaborators in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church hierarchy and clergy with the occupying Russian forces. That is true. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church missed a chance to distance itself early enough from these people. That is also true. But a few bad apples do not give us the right to damn or ban the entire organization. We have to evaluate the church's official position and its official statements. Argument number 4. The Ukrainian Security Services, the SBU, performed searches to try to find evidence of Russian affiliation. But what they have shown so far does not prove that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is a church directed by Russia. So if we say recent probes by the Ukrainian government have exposed the still existing ties between the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church, I'd like to know what that means. So to conclude, I am not claiming that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is impeccable or that it has done everything right. Far from it. They have made more than a few mistakes. But those mistakes do not constitute hanging offenses, and they do not give the Ukrainian government the right to deny the Ukrainian Orthodox Church the right to exist as such. Thank you very much.
Nadia, thank you for that fascinating insight into some of this history, into ways to think about these types of issues. And from there, let's turn it over now to Kathy, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Jose and Eric for the invitation to be here and to the Berkeley Center for organizing this important event. We've had 2 presentations and I too would like to directly answer the question that this webinar poses: is religious freedom under threat in Ukraine? I concur completely with our Archbishop that this war denies anyone any kind of freedom at all, religious or otherwise. And I would like to, much like Nadia did, focus more so on the Ukrainian side. And so in answer to the question, is religious freedom under threat in Ukraine? I would say it doesn't have to be. But I'm going to suggest 2 dynamics that I think can perhaps point us in the direction as to the forces that are perhaps either allowing for the persistence of religious freedom that did exist demonstrably in Ukraine prior to this war, and could perhaps allow it to endure in a post-combat Ukraine. as well as to propose two factors that we can all be looking at that are further indicators of issues of religious freedom and human rights in Ukraine. So I would like to depart a bit from what Nadia said and to think not simply in terms of laws that are proposed or words that are spoken by a few, but rather to think more about the perceptions on the ground as to the status of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and why that status might have changed sharply. Recent sociological surveys point to affiliation with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that is in the low single digits. And one of the reasons why the church has been, in terms of formal stated affiliation, at least so abandoned, is that there is a perception, and I believe one can point to certain tangible institutional and other connections that do in fact show links back to Moscow. First, it's important to underline, I mean, Eric mentioned the vocal support of the Russian Orthodox Church for this war. I would state that otherwise. I think the support for this war is not only audible, but visible. It has been actively demonstrated, not just by Patriarch Kirill, but by other members of the Russian Orthodox Church, and even by, for example, the some of the other religious denominations that similarly pledge an allegiance to the Russian state, President Putin, such as the Evangelical Baptists, who also have shown enthusiastic support for this war. So in looking forward as to how, in fact, religious freedom could be protected, I think a great deal hinges on how decisions are made at this critical juncture. Certainly, the war is an enormously complicating factor. And in the heat of a nearly year-long punishing war that promises to be unrelenting, it's very tempting for leaders in Ukraine to react politically for short-term advantage and to try to transform all potential forms of soft power into weapons to try to fortify Ukrainian sovereignty. But however, it's never really been more important than it is now to make decisions strategically, not necessarily reactively. It's important to point out that nearly all religious denominations in Ukraine have split with their co-religionists in Russia, specifically over this war. Not just a variety of Protestant faiths, but one can see these splits among Muslims, some Jewish groups. So on one level, it's not surprising that proposals for more formal divisions between the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, or Orthodoxy more broadly within Ukraine, to divorce it from the Russian Orthodox Church have now come to the fore under these conditions of war. About 2/3 of Ukrainians are Orthodox. But one of the reasons why, for example, small numbers of religious minority groups have so much influence in Ukraine is because of the transnational networks and alliances in which they're embedded. And I think at this point, we can say that the same is true of Orthodoxy. And I'd like to just note geopolitically what is at stake here, as well as the local conditions that complicate the decisions as to the status of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And both of these point to the potential of religion to clearly exacerbate the conflict in Ukraine now, and more importantly, even after this war ends. Geopolitically, the ecumenical patriarch in Constantinople was, of course, instrumental in securing Ukrainian autocephaly and creating the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. This is a monumental act, really a game-changing development within Orthodoxy. It places into question the status of the Russian Orthodox Church, and I think that's why the Russian Orthodox Church, which clearly does not recognize and does not act as if the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is independent and has a right to independent governance. And in fact, I believe they are willing to work together with President Putin so as to secure the religious subservience within Orthodoxy of Ukrainian Orthodoxy to Russian Orthodoxy, just as Mr. Putin is willing to wage war to render Ukrainian independence a moot point. Just as Putin claims Russians and Ukrainians are one people, the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church also advocates its conception of the Ruski Mir, Svetaya Rus, and all kinds of other concepts that link inextricably and eternally Orthodox believers in Ukraine with their brethren in Russia. So the geopolitical stakes, specifically for the status of the Russian Orthodox Church, are placed in question given the creation of the independent Orthodox Church of Ukraine, let alone what will be the fate of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church should it combine those churches combine, which was the among some the original plan. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the Orthodoxy in Ukraine, let's put it that way, would constitute arguably by some measures an Orthodox Church that would be every bit as important as the Russian Orthodox Church. Approximately 1/3 of the Russian Orthodox Church's parishes are in Ukraine. 3 of the most important monasteries are in Ukraine. Levels of religious practice are far higher in Ukraine than they are in Russia, and revenues by extension are also proportionally speaking higher. Had the Russian Orthodox Church not embarked on a massive church building campaign, as evidenced by the 200 Chram of the 200 churches program that aims to put a church within walking distance of every Muscovite, for example, the numbers would be even starker. And indeed, prior to that, after Ukrainian independence, fully at that point, half the churches within the Russian Orthodox Church were on Ukrainian territory. So geopolitically, the stakes are very significant for the Russian Orthodox Church to impede any kind of independence. On a local level, this is where it's very difficult for Ukrainian authorities to make decisions that are effective and strategic. Local allegiances are based not on a desire to be in communion with Patriarch Kirill or to be part of a state formation led by Mr. Putin. Those who perhaps claim an affiliation to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, certainly prior to the war, as I mentioned, their numbers are quite few now, their allegiances are based on heartfelt, sincere allegiance to a particular church. So under the guise of making strategic decisions, I would recommend that nonetheless, one speak in pursuing those churches, those clergy who have acted egregiously, to pursuing those egregious acts and identifying them, labeling them, and providing consequences for them, to frame them in terms of criminal offenses as opposed to collaboration. I base this suggestion on the fact that in post-1989 East Germany and Czechoslovakia, as it was called then, efforts to try to purge former collaborators with the secret police from entering government service also sought to identify collaborators. And instantaneously, it became very difficult to determine who was a collaborator and who was not, what constituted collaborative acts and what did not. I believe the same issue will arise. Does, for example, a priest of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church who provides humanitarian aid from Russia, does that constitute an act of collaboration? Does a similar member of the clergy who, under threat of physical harm, either to himself or to his family, re-registers his community, does that constitute an act of collaboration? These are very, very difficult determinations to make. And in those instances where there are far clearer forms of active subversion of the will of Ukrainians or active subversion of the Ukrainian state, I think there are criminal offenses that are defined that allow for due process, can be criminally prosecuted. And so I would recommend framing things in that direction. In terms of considering how how religious freedom can be ensured going forward, I would recommend looking at two things. One, we saw the celebration of a Christmas service at the Kiev-Pecheska Lavra by Metropolitan Epifania of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine at the Kiev-Pecheska Lavra, which is part of, was until that point under the jurisdiction of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Arguably, there might be many more such instances of multiple denominations claiming an access either to certain sacred sites, and how those claims, competing claims, will be handled. That initial service in January, for example, prompted Major Archbishop Shevchuk of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church to note that Pachayev, for example, was also under the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church at one point, with the implication being that perhaps the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church could have access to that monastery as well. And as a final point, I would just note that more recently, the level of trust in church, and this is the church, religious institutions more broadly, has dropped. At the same time that the level of trust in a multitude of other institutions has risen very, very significantly. Recent surveys by the Kiev International Institute of Sociology now place the church in the 10th position, behind, not surprisingly, things like volunteers of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, but also things like the Ukrainian government, the national police, the SBU, the secret, and the like. So in other words, we also need to think about why at this time levels of trust in religious institutions are slightly falling, and certainly falling greatly in comparison to other religious institutions. I think I'll end it there. Thank you for your attention.
Kathy, thank you very much. And for making these points about what are the right ways to frame some of the issues for collaboration, cooperation, et cetera, helping us think about transnational networks, ones that are vibrant, but also the breakdown with co-religionists. This is very, very helpful. Let me note for all of our speakers that we do have a couple of questions that have come up about dissent among the clergy, particularly on the Russian side, and also questions about how to think about conscientious objection on both sides of the border as people are called up to serve both in Ukraine and in Russia. Let me turn it over now to our next speaker. Frank, the floor is yours.
Yes, I will do a little bit of a historical background for those who did not come fully immersed into these affairs in which we are. But before doing it, I'll just make 2 points on the 2 earlier speakers. One point of importance is that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has not declared itself autocephalous or independent. It doesn't use this word autocephaly, and for a number of reasons I think will become clearer in my talk. And then when Kathy Warner brought up the issue of collaboration, I think at a point in which others are being tried, that is lay people, for collaboration in these areas, it would be hard to carve out the clergy as a group who would not be followed in, and I think they come under the legal structure. What I would like to do is show what are the problems the Ukrainian state faces at the moment. And I think this comes from a tradition in which the Russian Orthodox Church of the Russian Empire was first based in imperialism, and then in the 19th century became more closely allied with Russian nationalism. We much hear about the Russian world today. It is a complex issue, somewhat theological, but largely used in political terms. But I think for our purposes, we can say that it is one, the Russian claim to almost dominion in the Orthodox world, whether as the Third Rome or the current Orthodox power. And that two, the Russian Orthodox Church turned out to be the last imperial institution. Although it had been attacked by the Russian Revolution, it was restored by Stalin in 1943 to a patriarchate. And indeed, until the fall of the Soviet Union, it was a very peculiar institution in that 50% of all Orthodox churches in the Soviet Union were in Ukraine, and 25% of all Orthodox churches that were open were in the former Western Ukrainian, predominantly Ukrainian Greek Catholic areas. This meant that the church fulfilled in the Soviet period a Russianizing function in Ukraine, and particularly its Western areas. The Ukrainian state, modern Ukrainian state that first emerges after 1917, soon finds that although its leaders were largely socialist and not connected with religion, that religion would be an important part in deciding what many call the Russian Civil War and Ukrainians call the liberation struggles. And above all, on the 1st of January 1919, the Ukrainian National or People's Republic declared the Orthodox Church in Ukraine autocephalous and turned to Constantinople to reaffirm this. Had that state endured, I think it would have followed the pattern that we saw in Poland, where by 1924, a Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox church or autocephalous church was recognized by Constantinople. Instead, under the Soviets in the 1920s, groups who were reformist, who did not have bishops backing them, formed the Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church, which was destroyed in the late 1920s by Stalin. And that church, with traditional Episcopal ordination, was once again reformed during World War II. Why are these important? Because that church, that Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church, continued to exist in the Ukrainian diaspora and became very important in the affairs of Ukraine today. Everywhere in the 19th and 20th century, there have been the problem of the new autocephalies, and almost everywhere the state, whether the Romanian, the Bulgarian, have become involved in the issue of autocephaly. And in a certain way, the problem is that in the Orthodox Church, the creation of an autocephalous church is a very unclear process, but it still thinks from the time of Byzantium of somehow state structures being involved. And therefore, it is very hard in a country that is predominantly Orthodox to create an autocephalous church without some state intervention, as we found out in 2018. What is most important was the way the Soviet Union broke down, that religious freedom came to a degree, a very small degree, under Gorbachev. And this meant that the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and the Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church recreated themselves in Ukraine and became competitors with the Russian Orthodox Church. And they did so before Ukrainian independence was declared. And therefore, in many ways, those movements pushed affairs from what was formerly the Russian Orthodox Church towards the declaration in late 1990 of the formation of a Ukrainian Orthodox Church out of the Russian Orthodox Exarchate in Ukraine, and later became involved with the state once it was declared under Kravchuk, being involved in trying to promote autocephaly. So we've seen various Ukrainian governments since 1991 involved in Orthodox affairs, some backing the idea of having an autocephalous church, and some backing the Moscow patriarchal jurisdiction in Ukraine that was called the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The other, I think, crucial thing to remember is that many of the most Ukrainian elements had left this church. And therefore, the Ukrainian wing of the church was relatively weak in this. This gave particular, I think, opportunities for the more pro-Russian Orthodox Moscow wing, particularly under Yanukovych, but not only. And then all of this came to a head during the Maidan, when Ukraine was divided, and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church viewed some of its followers as being opposed to the Maidan, and some of them even positive towards the Russian invasion of Ukraine of 2014. The classic case was the refusal of Metropolitan Onufry to stand in memory of soldiers of the Ukrainian army. On the other hand, the government of Ukraine, particularly under Poroshenko, became convinced that unless the church in Ukraine received recognition by the Orthodox world for the two then existing independent churches, it's a complicated story, I won't go through it all, and uniting with what he hoped would be the church he had belonged to, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, then still part of the Russian Orthodox Church, that the Ukrainian state would be weakened. And so we see another intervention in 2018. So when we talk about religious freedom, I think we've got to remember the realities of what went on both prior in the Ukrainian case, but also generally because of this specific problem of autocephaly and Orthodox organization. What have we seen since the full-scale invasion? We have seen collaboration and, I would argue, treason by some members of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, including bishops. We have seen support of the Russian occupying authorities that would go beyond the point that we would largely call of being enforced. We have seen a maintenance by some of Russian world views, but one can have these views if one wishes. The problem is that can one have them in a country under war? And of course, there's great fear that there are still elements of that church and particularly clergy who were oriented towards the Russian Orthodox tradition for a long time, still being part of this. There are challenges to oligarchs such as Novinsky, who received sanctions, who clearly intervened in state affairs in the advantage of the church, as well as certain economic resources for that church that might benefit it. And those are being investigated. The major issues become the properties, since in this world, and people I think in the West would not be used to the idea that Notre Dame, well, maybe in France it's even more possible to conceive of it, but that major church buildings are owned by the state, and the state can dispose of them. And until recently, these were disposed very largely in favor of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that had been part of the Russian Orthodox Church. That is, the Kiev Lavra was in their hands, the Pochayu Lavra, the Sviatohirsk. The question would be, can the state, as it has done, change this? And of course it could, once agreements of leaseholding were held up. What can I see as a future now in the current situation? In a time of war, there is great distrust of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and reason to distrust some of its clergy. There is also a confusion within that church, as we have seen by the recent statement of 10 points by many of its priests and clergy, who have asked the hierarchs of that church to make more specific in 10 different ways that they have severed their relations with the Russian Orthodox Church. So it is not only the Ukrainian church that is involved, the Ukrainian state that is involved in this issue, but internally within the church. Of course, the matters have to be decided on religious freedom within the church. And then concluding, what we now see is a split in international orthodoxy that has come about since 2018, of which Ukraine is very much a part. The realization that to some degree, what does it mean to be an Orthodox country? And here, as Ukraine seeks to join the EU, I think we have to look at how does Greece deal with these issues, in which the Greek Orthodox Church has a specific role in the country, and yet it is viewed as possible to be a member of the EU. And after all, we do have the Church of England, which is now being discussed and rediscussed. And then we have the final issue of how do we decide who belongs to what church? Much of the conflict in Ukraine now occurs because it is unclear who belongs to a parish and how it should be divided. Within all of this, the Ukrainian state, despite the war, has to maintain religious freedom and shows that to the degree it can. On the other hand, it does have the right to investigate specific individuals and contexts that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has had in the past. Thank you.
Frank, thank you for that very illuminating way to think about some of the context that's been going on over time. It's quite confusing for outsiders to fully appreciate and understand, and also raising these questions about things like property and church-state relations. In the West, we've often seen this as churches split or denominations split, and the property is owned by a denomination versus a local congregation. But it is a very different thing in these types of situations when these properties and support are directly owned by the state or subsidized heavily. And this is very useful for us to be thinking about today. So with that, we'll turn it to our last of the formal presentations before we get to a wider Q&A. Jose Casanova.
Well, thank you, Eric, and thank you, my colleagues that came before me. Being the last, practically every important point has been made. So I'm going to amplify some of the points, especially 3 points. The first point made by Nadia about denominations, the right to denominate oneself, to take one's name and be recognized by others by this name. Now, we know that this is one of the principles of the modern world system of religions. The fact that each religion claims the right to have its name, its identity, and to be particular, and to be unique, and to be recognized by others as such. I think that it was a mistake on the part of the state, the Ukrainian state, to try to enforce through legislation the change of the name. These things happen. I mean, in the War of Independence, the Anglican Church in the United States changed its name to the Episcopal Church, but this is the other way around. So here it was basically social pressure that forced the Anglican Church, if it wanted to remain in the United States, to break ties with the mother church in England and to call itself the Episcopal Church. Now, had the Ukrainian Orthodox Church done this more clearly, perhaps it would have been necessary to precisely force the church to really come to terms with this very, very ambiguous situation. Ambiguous in many respects. Let's face it, this was the church that had hegemony over the Soviet period. Basically, they continue its hegemony, being the one largest in terms of buildings, also in terms of bishops, in terms of priests, because of a lot of money coming from different places. And yet this church, after, never even once said a mea culpa for its role in repressing the other churches, the other religious communities. There has never been a statement on the part of this church, yes, we agree, we don't claim to be the territorial church of Ukraine. But in fact, after breaking with Moscow, they still made a claim that they are the church of Ukraine. And which implies that the other Christian churches really do not have as much a right to be there. It's implicit only, but they never abandon this claim to territoriality. They've never come to terms with the Ruski Mir as a territorial ideology of one single church, basically uniting all these territories. They've never come to terms with this. So there are fundamental issues why, on the one hand, yes, one has to be careful. The state should not force change of names, but one can understand precisely under conditions of war. And this is the other issue. Under conditions of war, we know that sometimes these type of mistakes are made. In the United States, in every war, groups were forced to change their names of their towns. The Germans in World War I, the Japanese were interned in World War II, and there have been always these cases. I mean, and yet, does it mean that religious freedom is under threat in Ukraine? I believe not fully, but we should be careful, and one should be aware of the possibilities that under those conditions of war, there could be also a swell towards the formation of a state-established national church that would threaten the kind of dynamics of religious pluralism that have made Ukraine so unique within Europe. And I think that for the sake of protecting this unique institution, AUKRO, and to make sure that indeed at the level of the state, all denominations are equal in terms of their rights. Although, of course, I fully agree with Frank that precisely in the Orthodox world, the role of the state remains fundamental. Concerning the question of the theology of just war and the discussion of these issues in the Orthodox world, I just came 2 weeks ago from the meeting of the IOTA, the International Orthodox Theological Association, 400 Orthodox theologians from all over the world, from all the churches in Europe, but also from Africa and Asia. And this was a central issue. They are grappling. Orthodox theology is now grappling with those issues, and they're in the process of coming to terms. But they're especially grappling with what they call, since the 19th century Council of Constantinople, ethnophilitism. And they realized that the Russian imperial war is the most dramatic expression of this ethnophilitism, the kind of Russian nationalism that has these territorial claims over the old Ruski Mir, and therefore identifies Russian national identity with what was the Ruski historical lands. So yes, we must be careful, we must be vigilant and critical to protect the unique model of religious pluralism that has emerged in Ukraine. And I wanted to actually ask Imogen perhaps to give us a picture of this past week. There you have it here. You have, surrounded by the Pope, you have all the religious leaders of all the religious communities of Ukraine. This is AUKRO, the All-Ukrainian Council of Church and Religious Organizations. The Pope, and his right is the chief rabbi of Ukraine, but there is another rabbi there. On the left is Metropolitan Epiphany, the head of the Orthodox of Ukraine. Next to him is Metropolitan Sevchuk, the head of the Greek Catholic. Next to the rabbi is the head of the Armenian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And then you see the muftis there, and you see obviously those who have no clerical garbs. You can imagine they are the Protestant leaders, and you have also representatives of the, I don't recognize him by Father Filipovich, I understand was there. I mean, this is a unique symbolic expression that even in the midst of war, it's possible to bring all of these groups together and that have this kind of working together. And I think that this is precious, and every vigilance has to be put into effect to make sure that this is not undermined. Having this said, for many, many years, I've been hoping that Ukraine will be the place where the three Romes come together. The first and the second Rome have come together for a long time, and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church claims to want to be in communion with both, with Rome and with Constantinople. The third Rome is more problematic because we know they also have broken now relations to a certain extent with the second Rome, with Constantinople. So Ukraine is the key, not only of how the two Ukrainian Orthodox churches learn to live together before union. Let's not talk of union. Let's talk simply of accepting each other as sister churches, recognizing to live together. But for this, of course, there has to be a process of mutual recognition. And both have to abandon the claim of being the territorial church of Ukraine, and therefore accept that we have to learn to live together. It's true that the numbers are very low, only perhaps today 5%. According to the last survey, only 5% of the population of Ukraine claim to be members of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. But nonetheless, 5% is a lot of people, and they are citizens of Ukraine. They are Ukrainians, and as long as they basically can be patriotic Ukrainians and still want to be members of this church, and this right has to be recognized. So the question is, how do we find a means to precisely mediate this conflict through conversations, through dialogue, through mediations, rather than through legislation from above? So this is a task, and in this respect, I think all the religious communities and all the churches have something positive, a contribution to make. But especially, I understand that even in the last 2 days, there was a meeting of the two Orthodox churches in Święta Sofia, and again, conversations continue, and let's hope that they will continue further.
Nadia, go ahead and pick up on this.
Okay, thanks. First of all, congratulations to Georgetown for putting together such a panel with valuable information for everyone to be able to draw on. I think this will be an incredibly useful resource going forward. In that spirit, I just wanted to pick up on like a couple of points of fact that my illustrious colleagues have mentioned. For Kathy, it is indeed, and this actually is connected to what Jose said as well, the voluntary separation of a church from the organization to which it might have belonged earlier. It's absolutely true about the Episcopalian Church versus the Anglican Church. And Kathy, you didn't mention this one, but I think it's especially indicative that even the Ukrainian old believers also made this separation. So it's actually very clear that throughout Ukraine, there is on the part of everyone that I can think of, including the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, a revulsion at Russia's aggressive war against Ukraine and a distance to want to separate itself. So absolutely. Frank, absolutely true. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church did not say it was autocephalous. I said that it was acting as if it was autocephalous. The language that it used was Nezalezhna и samostina. So independent, what does that mean? Absolutely fair point. But it's not Stalin who created the Moscow Patriarchate. That was created at the Patriarchate was restored at the Great Council of 1917-18. And indeed, as Scott Kenworthy points out in his new work on Patriarch Tikhon, it is a great pity that the Russian Orthodox Church has not chosen to follow in that spirit, but that indeed Patriarch Kirill now embodies the worst authoritarian traits that everyone else has pointed out. Absolutely true. And finally, just one last point. I don't think it's completely true that the clerics who stayed in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church were monolithically pro-Russian. I think Metropolite Volodymyr Sabodan is a clear example to the contrary. But really, thanks to everyone for putting these points out there and being such a great resource for the intellectual community at large.
Now, before, Frank, I see your hand. Before I get to you, Frank, what I had planned to do, and I thank you for those elaborations, Nadia. I plan to let each panelist take 2 minutes just to add a point or to make a clarification on their remarks based on what they'd heard. So let me go back to the Archbishop first, and then we'll kind of go down the line, and then we'll open up to the wider questions. Let me also ask all the panelists, we've already answered a few of the questions that are getting there in the chat, but to please read those, and we'll come to those in just a few moments. Archbishop Boris, would you like to make any other comments now that you've heard the other speakers?
Thomas, can you see the last point?
I think the path that Kathy Warner proposed is very important. It's very important to sense the context, sense the society, and understand the history. Yes, there are legal issues, what somebody said or did not say. The question is, what are the long-term effects of long-term policies? And even if these policies are not formulated in a clear way, clearly there is a crisis in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. There's a question posed to me in the chat, is there a difference between what the laity feel and the clergy feel? I don't think the divide is according to clergy and laity. We know for a fact that there are still people in Ukraine. For example, in Kharkiv, I was talking with the Bishop of Kharkiv today, that believe the Russian propaganda. Reductio ad Hitlerum is not always, a useful thing, but it is really toxic what can be done through propaganda and through the ideological manipulation of religion. And, it's a question of life and death. It's a question of children being deprived of their parents. It's the destruction of cities. And this what we are hearing from Patriarch Kirill, what we are not hearing from all of the bishops, Nadia, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's about 300 bishops in the Moscow Patriarchate in Russia. Not a single one, not one single bishop has spoken out against this war. And I think out of approximately 40,000 clerics, if I'm not mistaken, in the Russian Orthodox Church globally, only about 300 have spoken out against the war in a written form, and they are mostly outside of Russia. The desire to have a break is a desire to preserve one's life, to preserve children, to preserve cities. We're not talking just about abstract rights. There needs to be a lot more understanding of the things that Kathy and Frank maybe were speaking about, the history and the culture and the context, to make this discussion really salient. I think many in the West have taken a lot of time to even approach understanding what has been going on. There are some politicians today who are belatedly saying, like the German ambassador in Washington, I think 2 months ago, wrote and said, well, we were just wrong. We were just wrong. But you don't hear Angela Merkel saying this, or Romano Prodi, or Berlusconi, or Sarkozy. I sat next to Tony Blair in Davos last week, and he was kind of reminiscing what Putin had told him. He couldn't believe Putin was telling him that we will not let Ukraine decide its future. And Tony Blair couldn't believe what Putin was telling him. So I would echo what Professor Kizhenko has said, that I think this is a very good convening, and we need much more of this. And I think people in Ukraine need more. They need to be connected, because the words, the legislation, public statements made in Ukraine need to be understood and in a way that is constructive. In other words, they have to be expressed in a way that is constructive, not only in the country, but internationally.
Thank you for that. And thanks for raising the important point about how successful Russian, what we might call information operations, propaganda, and various forms of telling its story have been. This is, I think, poorly understood in the West, that there's been really a very, very successful, not just social media and with bots and trolls and all this type of media manipulation, but also public diplomacy from the foreign minister of Russia and others, going around the world, meeting with senior leaders and saying to them things like, Ukraine really brought this on itself. And don't you know that NATO just keeps pushing and pushing and pushing? It's just like the rest of the West. It's Hollywood, it's New York, it's the Americans. They're just always pushing. And we have to take some action. Big NATO, 800 million people. Little Russia, just 150 million of us. We're constantly under threat by all of this stuff. Isn't the West neglecting its responsibilities? Shouldn't it be putting more money towards COVID-19 and humanitarian work in poor countries? It's a campaign with lots of little nuanced elements, but it's tickled the ears of leaders in the Far East, in Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. And it really has been an insidious, but extremely clever and successful campaign. So thank you for pointing to this element. And let me turn it over to Kathy for a follow-on.
Well, I concur completely that that this is really literally a matter of life and death. And we need to take stock of the fact that, for example, Tony Blair, I think that's an excellent example. Putin told him straight to his face, we will never let Ukraine decide its fate. And I'm sure Tony Blair thought, but that's not possible, and dismissed it as rhetoric. There have been so many instances where one thinks about, Sarkozy giving the, was it Légion d'honneur to Putin, and we see the man who we think we want to see, and when he says certain things like we will never let Ukraine decide its future, or I am capable of using nuclear weapons, we all think, he will never do that. I mean, any military tactician would have told you that it's sheer insanity to try to invade Ukraine, because even if you can invade it, you'll never be able to hold it. And this is, of course, precisely what we're facing now. I mean, in other words, it was a horrifically misguided decision to invade Ukraine, but he did it anyway. All this by way of saying, it's important to delineate what a person says from what they in fact do, and what in fact has consistently happened over time. And I think Frank laid out very well the persistent, and also Archbishop, about the persistent oppression of any kind of religious dissent that moved beyond the Russian Orthodox Church. So all of this by way of saying the single largest threat to religious freedom in Ukraine, I believe, unfortunately stems from the imperial assumption that Russia is entitled to Ukraine. That's the single biggest threat. What we can influence and what we can do is perhaps pay some attention to what Ukrainians can do in terms of shaping their own fate. And I mentioned a few things, but I do think that for those of us who are not in Ukraine, who do have electricity and who do have heat, it's especially incumbent upon us to think long term, not certainly during this war, what kinds of decisions must be made now, but looking very long term to the future, so that those decisions that are made now do not replicate or in any way exacerbate tensions or conflicts that exist within Ukrainian society. The level of social cohesion that has been generated hopefully can be maintained, and based on decisions that are made now, there does not in any way have to be any kind of diminishment of the religious freedom and the religious pluralism that is predicated on significant tolerance within Ukrainian society for a variety of religious confessions, as illustrated in the photograph that Jose Casanova showed us. But the impossible situation that the Russian Orthodox Church has placed above all in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has not only triggered these kinds of splits, but there was a question in the chat about conscientious objection. At this point, most religious confessions in Ukraine, of which there are many, especially on the Protestant side, who drew on an Anabaptist tradition that practiced conscientious objection, have abandoned that. It's really, to the best of my knowledge, only the Mennonites that still maintain a conscientious objection, but they are very active providers of humanitarian aid within Ukraine. So they are doing what they can to mitigate the horrific suffering that has been imposed on the Ukrainian people. But this war has so far triggered not only a radical change in doctrine in certain religious confessions. I also happen to be Swiss by nationality. I mean, Switzerland has all but abandoned its historic neutrality, its policy of neutrality. On many different levels, this is seen as a just war to be fought. And I do think it's important that many of the decisions that be made in terms of mitigating negative influences and the kinds of egregious actions that come from them, whether aiding or abetting the killing of Ukrainian civilians, that those acts need to be pursued, but they need to be pursued in a way that is according to the rule of law. I understand this will be slow and this will be frustrating to many, but if we are doing all of this with the intention of joining the European Union and having a society that is based on the rule of law, I think we should perhaps start now. And those who have undermined Ukrainian sovereignty must be identified, and consequences must be meted out for that. But it needs to be done very systematically and very transparently and very methodically according to due process. And I think these difficult situation that all of that pertains above and beyond to the status of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, sorry, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. That's the one that's in the most difficult of all position right now. And so determining that status needs to be very judiciously determined.
Kathy, thank you. And I'm going to go Frank. I see your hand, Nadia. I'm going to go Frank, Jose, then Nadia. And let me just point out as we go forward a couple of questions that are slightly different that have to do with the, first of all, at some point, would someone say something about the way that religious actors are involved in humanitarian efforts on the ground? And second, at some point, would someone say something about, there's a question about the role of the European Union. We've heard a bit about Germany thus far, but anything about the European Union, and in specific, the role that the question asks it as Catholic Poland has played in all of this. Frank, over to you.
Okay, so again, so what I thank Nadia for pointing out. I had meant that the patriarchate had lapsed and Stalin brought it back, and she is quite correct that there were many pro-Ukrainian people and clergy within the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. What I meant was that the most Ukrainian wing had left. And I think that also explains why the church did not Ukrainianize to a greater degree over those 30 years. That is, either as a liturgical language, in the restoration of Ukrainian ecclesial traditions, and in public perception to a great degree. So in a way that is the vision that people come into the current situation with. Then as far as the current problems of the war and how the state deals with religious groups, I think there was a feeling by many that because the issue of autocephaly was the project of Petro Poroshenko, when the Zelensky won the election, this issue of autocephaly, including the Tomos, was viewed as his opponent's issue. And I think in a degree, people say that they stayed away from church affairs. And there would be those who would argue that the government's failure, particularly before the war, but even including the war, to more closely at least monitor situations. That is the situation of the Caves Monastery and the Metropolitan, who has caused great controversy, who headed it. Not that the church, and this is, we're back to state and church. Can the state intervene? Well, in this case, where the state owns the property and had the right to break the lease, had it made clearer a little earlier to the Metropolitan that it continued following of these paths or singing songs within the Lavra that are Russian traditional religious songs, might not be the best way to get your lease done. Should this be? Perhaps not, but it is the situation in Ukraine, the double situation that the state owns a large part of this property, and that now we have a situation where what is declared a religious community can change the jurisdiction of a church or parish, when it is very hard to decide who are the members. In Germany, people pay a church tax. You know who belongs then, at least, to who are Catholics, who are Protestant. In Ukraine, where a village usually is a united group, who should decide who's a member of the religious community if they are baptized in? And this has caused great problems. And then just on the broader questions brought up, the two of these, the religious organizations have done tremendous work, including the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. There have been massive campaigns to gain aid. They have worked to a degree together, mostly independently. I sent recently to Nadia something I found startling, that a Moscow patriarchal parish in the United States was raising aid for Ukraine and sending it through a Ukrainian Orthodox Church. I mean, I would have never pictured something like this happening, but the congregation there had a lot to say on that issue. So I think the religious actors have been extremely important, as we pointed out, the aid. A particularly heroic role in the areas under occupation by the Protestant groups who have been persecuted horribly, and I think will come out of this conflict with a much higher level of public esteem because of the kind of aid that they have provided, and not that they are alone in it. And then as far as the European community, there are two issues. One, the European community, which of course what has shifted is that now overwhelmingly the Ukrainian population wants to join both the European community and NATO. So issues that still were unresolved, I would argue, even 2 years ago, now are definitely resolved. Ukraine wants to be part of the European community. It wants to be part of NATO. I would think the European community indeed needs Ukraine now for a number of reasons, because Ukrainians are willing to stand up for European values in a way that are not obvious. And as far as Poland goes, this is part of a long period of reconciliation that's taken place between Poles and Ukrainians. It has occurred largely after the independence of Ukraine. It has had ups and downs. There is no path that goes straight on it, but the tremendous outpouring of, and I would argue not as strongly the church in Poland, although Archbishop Borys may provide more information on that. The church has done a lot too, but the outpouring of the Polish population en masse and often without organization. Now, of course, the Polish population is still overwhelmingly identifies as Catholic, and in that way it can be seen as associated with it, has certainly brought those two groups much more closely together.
Thank you very much for that, Frank. Jose?
Yes, let me reiterate the importance of the interreligious humanitarian aid done by all religious groups, mosques, synagogues, Protestant churches, Greek Catholic churches, both Orthodox churches. All of them have played the role of refuge, humanitarian aid to any individual in Ukraine, to all religious groups. I was myself witness in Irpin. The Greek Catholic Church was under duress. They were refugees there. They were saved by Baptists. The rabbis play a crucial role and continue to play a crucial role. They send their families home. The Greek Catholic priests send their families to Western Ukraine, and all of them are very involved as individuals in humanitarian aid throughout the war. Second, and the European Union, we ought to remember that besides Brussels, the presidency also rotates. Right now Sweden is the presidency of the European Union, and they are very involved. They are very involved in thinking how they can help Ukraine, precisely humanitarian aid, reconstruction, how to reconstruct university institutions, this kind of thing. So there is an understanding that these, especially the voluntary sector, the strengthening of civil society is very important. That the weakness of the Ukrainian system was, on the one hand, a very strong civil society, but with not clear links with the state. There was no political party system, really, a lot of corruption at the level of political society. And that now the question has to be done how to strengthen the states, the judiciary, the political institutions, civil society, and how they can work together. There is a lot of understanding on both sides. And Ukraine public opinion surveys indicate that the majority of Ukrainians want the pressure of the European Union so that corruption really is reformed in Ukraine, so that they want to to have the pressure of the European Union to advance democratization and more transparency at the political institutions.
Thank you for that, Jose. Nadia?
Okay. I wanted to, since since Archbishop Boris asked the question, his numbers are absolutely correct. Alas, the Russian Orthodox Church has indeed compromised itself, or that has lost in any moral credibility it might have had. That's one reason why everyone is running from it as fast as possible, and that in fact the photograph that Jose asked to show with of ACRO, the All Ukrainian Council of Religious Organizations, that is what we all are fighting for somehow. That is what we want, this Ukrainian model of a vibrant civil and religious society, which is the antithesis of what we have in Russia. This is precisely the point. That is what Ukraine has been, and that is what we want Ukraine to be. And just to answer one of the questions in the chat about why didn't the Ukrainian Orthodox Church declare autocephaly, because they saw what happened to Patriarch Filaret when he declared autocephaly unilaterally and no one else picked up on it. So it's essentially, they're trying to follow a canonical path. And as Frank pointed out, it's a very tricky situation and everyone is somehow trying to wend their way. But the bottom line is that the Ukrainian vibrant civil society, religious freedom model is the one that we want. So that's all.
That's great. That's great. Kathy, and then Jose.
Just to elaborate on 2 points that Nadia just said, and one of the questions in the chat. Just a small point on the issue of name. I think one of the reasons why in the paragraph advertising this webinar and elsewhere, one reads about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate is precisely because of Filaret and his church also choosing Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kiev Patriarchate so as to delineate between the two. For clarity's sake, I don't think there's any kind of attempt to diminish the rights of a particular church, but really to just be clear as to what one is speaking about. And I think that explains then the use of a designation for a church that it might not use for itself. I'm an anthropologist, not a theologian, but nonetheless, I dare to mention this. I think one of the other really significant stakes that we have here, and this I'm combining what Nadia just said in one of the questions in the chat by Doug Hostetter asking about, it seems like the lack of separation of church and state is central to this conflict. And I think that is true. And the established principle among Orthodoxy of one people, one church, should their religious freedom extend, and we should allow for then the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to coexist with the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, that then introduces the possibility of institutional reformation of established models, which could then pave the way potentially for different kinds of theologies and doctrinal innovations to come about. And when one adds to this the fact that the Russian Orthodox Church has made very clear not just its promotion of traditional values understood in terms of very conservative understandings of gender and sexual-based identities, but increasingly a celebration of militarism as a fundamental component of parish culture. You start to then have different kinds of orthodoxies emerging, and depending on the status and the kind of tenor that develops and evolves within the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, we could potentially see a flourishing of different kinds of orthodoxies. And I think this is of note. This possibility does not escape anyone's attention. And I think that is a very real possibility. And the question is whether that is a tendency that one wishes to allow to flourish, or perhaps whether there would be attempts to block that possibility of having multiple kinds of orthodoxies existing, certainly within Ukraine, but by extension within the Orthodox world. And whether, which way one's position on that issue goes, I think does go to the heart of what should be the relationship of a particular Orthodox church within a particular state. Frank has very eloquently explained why the state plays such a fundamental role in both the creation and the maintenance of Orthodox churches, and the very particularities of not just state ownership of lands upon which religious buildings exist, not just in Ukraine, but elsewhere throughout the former Soviet Union. We have a similar kind of a situation. All this by way of saying the stakes are really tremendously high for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and the kinds of the decisions that will be made going forward. They will surely have reverberations throughout the broader Orthodox world and begin to shape broader geopolitical alliances.
Kathy, thank you for that. And I want to ask the group, we're going to go to Jose and then to the Archbishop. And I just want to throw out a question there. And I'm thinking in part about, we have a lot of experts listening to this, but this is also, we're a university at Georgetown. We have students who are listening to this. And I've been trying to think about the types of questions my students would be the most likely to ask in the classroom. And picking up something Kathy said for the group, Ukraine is in a unique position that its current president is not a person with a public demonstrable religious faith. But in a counterfactual, is there some concern that we might get a militant, I'm going to use that word that Kathy brought up, a sort of Orthodox nationalist rising to the political level of being president or something in Ukraine? Is that possible? Do we see those voices emerging on the scene about a kind of a militant religious nationalism with Ukraine focus? And tied to that, other than this religious nationalism that Putin has espoused really for the past decade in many ways, do we see that type of militant religion-informed nationalism in Belarus or any other of these countries? So Jose, and then the Archbishop, and then anyone who wants to chime in on these issues.
I let the other respond to this issue, but I wanted to add something. It's very important that we recognize the war, really a war going on within global orthodoxy for territorial control. It's a process of territoriality, because Ruski Mir, the idea is that Ukraine is ours. The ecumenical patriarch had no right to take Ukraine from us and to give autocephaly. Any other church, global Orthodox church that recognizes the autocephaly of the Ukrainian church, then we break with them. So there is a war going on with the Patriarch of Alexandria over Africa. There are wars going on over parishes throughout the diasporas. Those are territorial wars. So we have to begin thinking about how to somehow come to terms with a form of canonicity which is not territorial in the sense of state territoriality, if you wish. But I don't see the problem or the risk of a politician. It's not a militant orthodoxy. You don't have it in Ukraine precisely because Kathy has just published a book. Unique about Ukraine was that the largest numbers of Orthodox in Ukraine declare themselves simply Orthodox. They wanted to be parts of these wars. So there is no, Orthodoxy has not made use. In fact, you could say that publicly, because of the internal divisions, it was the weakest link in all the interreligious networks and collaborations of groups. And that's why the Greek Catholics, the Protestants, the Jews, the Muslims could play such a role in Okro that otherwise the Orthodox should have played. So in this respect, I don't think that we are there, that there is a threat we cannot see from the past. Whether war conditions could change, we don't know.
Archbishop?
Yeah, I would agree with what Jose just said. For the same reasons, and for an additional one. Right now, the kind of sociological departure from the Moscow Patriarchate or sociological allegiance to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine is something that is more let's say, in the realm of preferences as opposed to the realm of practice. Most of these people never go to any church. In fact, for Easter, I think the practice in Kyiv is somewhere around 5 to 7% on Easter Sunday. Otherwise, it's 2 or 3%, which is the levels of Moscow as well. There are, of course, different percentages in Western Ukraine and in rural areas. I think during the war, Ukrainian Orthodoxy is kind of a banner. The autocephaly is a banner. It's a banner not only for, but it's a banner against. Somebody told me that they were very happy that the Ukraine Orthodox Church of Ukraine celebrated in the Church of the Dormition in the Cave and Caves Monastery, because they never saw so many atheists in church. All the Ukrainian cultural activists who have, not too much use for the church in any real personal way, showed up there to kind of make a stand. And they saw each other joyfully. So the reason why there won't be, I think, a militant Ukrainian Orthodox political movement is because society is moving in a different direction. And this will be the great challenge for the churches. The churches need to be churches. They need to have authentic theologies. They need to be close to the poor. I think many of the things that Pope Francis has been trying to emphasize, especially through his call for a pastoral conversion, is something that really needs to be heard in Ukraine. And the Ukrainian Greek Catholic bishops put out a pastoral letter where they summoned themselves to a pastoral conversion. The church cannot be as it is and survive. It is, Kathy, I think, pointed out the decline in the status of the church as a moral authority from position 2-3 to position 10. So that is one trend. The real question for the churches is, will they be churches? Not surrogates for a state, not instruments for a war. Sometimes you need a surrogate for the state. Sometimes, the church needs to make a stand during the war. But we're talking about normal functions for families, for teenagers, for people who are traumatized after the war, for people struggling with alcohol. This will be the work of the church to help people understand their dignity, that it's a divine gift. They're created in the image of likeness of God. One point that I'd like to add, which is kind of a point of both association and delineation, ecclesially and culturally, is the question of the calendar. The Julian calendar was maintained in Ukraine, both by the Orthodox churches and the Greek Catholics throughout the 20th century, even though many Orthodox churches adopted the so-called Gregorian or New Calendar in the 20th century. Of course, this was a calendar decreed by Pope Gregory in 1582, and consequently rejected as being papist by the British Empire for over 100 years. But astronomically, it is more accurate. And there is now, in the last weeks, since before and during and after Christmas, a strong movement from below, particularly from lay people, saying our churches need to join, as it is said, the rest of the world in celebrating Christmas. This Sunday at the Ukrainian Catholic Cathedral, Greek Catholic Cathedral in Paris, was the first service according to the Gregorian calendar. when I became bishop here 10 years ago, all parishes were on the old calendar. Now, only 1 out of 39 parishes in the 5 countries of the eparchy are, the parish in Lourdes still maintains the old calendar. Patriarch Sviatoslav and Metropolitan Epifani have agreed to form a commission to discuss this. The position of the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is we shouldn't change the calendar without doing so along with our Orthodox brethren. I understand that the next gathering of Ukrainian Greek Catholic bishops in Ukraine will be confronting this issue, because they're being pushed very much by the lay people. The Ukrainian Catholic University had a whole academic seminar about explaining what this calendar means and how it evolved historically and astronomically. This is a desire to associate with a broader world, but of course, it's also a desire to delineate and disassociate with the Russian world. So there are many levels in which this desire to say a church that is promoting this war is not ours, it should not be ours, should be at a distance, it's dangerous, it needs to be kept at bay and out of our sphere of influence.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And these are very helpful nuances, because people from outside of faith tradition don't know what a big deal certain things are and how symbolic and powerful they are. And we might just gloss over it in a news report or not even notice it. And these types of things are such a helpful part of today's panel. Let me turn it over to Frank and then to Kathy.
Yeah, just a short thing on, you asked about what students would ask, and why is this all so important? I think we've got to remember that over 100,000 people probably have died in Ukraine. We don't know really how many. We are talking about distinctions that might seem very fine distinctions between two Orthodox groups and the Ukrainian Catholic group. And by the way, and one way of adding why Ukraine would never have an Orthodox one is that there's a large Ukrainian Catholic Church, active Roman Catholics and Protestants. But I think what we should really remember is, for those who died in Mariupol, there was no priest for them. They were bombed in that theater, and people's lives were lost. We don't know, 10,000, 15,000 people are dead in the ruins of that city. And I think both in Ukraine, when Kathy pointed out the drop of religion in this, on one hand, religion has dropped in general authority, partially because other institutions have gone up. Everyone knows it's the army that will save them as in their life now. What the church then has been doing, or the churches have been doing, is giving what comfort they could to their followers. And these distinctions and disputes have often at times lowered the level, the esteem for the churches, as people have argued where you were baptized, who can bury you, what goes on. These have been the great dangers in Ukraine. But never has there been, I think, such a need for every kind of comfort that a population can have. And that's going to continue on. When we talked about what the future of the churches will be as churches, we're going to have a traumatized society for a generation more. And when I pointed out that the Protestants have not only done relief work, they have frequently also done counseling. Caritas has done huge work, the Orthodox churches have done. But I don't think it's only the material work, it's that the churches have to prepare in this religious pluralism of how they're going to deal with the Ukraine that comes out of this war. And that will be extremely.
Well, I certainly agree that there's all kinds of work that already now, and certainly going forward, even more so, will need to be done to help heal the physical, emotional, and mental health traumas that have been inflicted on the Ukrainian population. One reason why I really think that religion deserves more attention than it generally gets is because many people looking at issues of the political import of religion or issues of religious freedom look to formal attendance at religious institutions. And as the Archbishop pointed out, they are low in Ukraine. And one could simply extrapolate from that that commitments are similarly weak. But that is not at all the case. And I would like to explain why that is so and why the political import of religion is very, very significant, and perhaps why difficulties in terms of changing allegiance have cropped up. Although people might only to a minimal judging by American standards, to a minimal degree, actively practice religion within institutional confines on Sunday morning. That's not to say that there aren't a wide roster of religious practices that people don't engage in, either outside of a formal liturgy, but let's say at a monastery or some other kind of sacred site, or that all kinds of forms of religious symbolism don't have tremendous meaning to people. I see behind the Archbishop icons on the wall. One can find icons in homes across Ukraine. All of this by way of saying that religion has an import for everyday life, and by extension then politically, in ways that don't fit traditional Protestant or Catholic or other kinds of categories that are generally used for assessing religion in Europe or in North America. And we need to take stock of the ways in which religion gains meaning and shapes people's thinking, and how the different ways in which religion could be meaningful in terms of healing and addressing, well, in the immediate present, providing humanitarian aid and other forms of comfort, but in the longer term, in terms of healing what will surely be a trauma that will be experienced for generations to come. And so I think it is really important to take stock of the critical role that religion at this juncture really commands in terms of either exacerbating the conflicts that exist in Ukraine by either becoming instrumentalized or allowing itself to become instrumentalized. And the tendency for that is great because, as I said, it is a key factor in terms of far larger geopolitical alliances, and it is a very hard form of soft power that could shape this conflict going forward. But it also has the potential to play a very meaningful role in preventing exactly the kind of leadership that Eric alluded to, even though in an increasingly militarized Ukraine as well, that possibility exists, and the really the strident wish of, I think, a great many Ukrainians to sharply delineate themselves from Russians and from what they see as the total loss of any kind of moral compass, surely among the hierarchy of the Russian Orthodox Church, but even more broadly among Russians, where the protests against the wanton slaughter of civilians is really not heard. We understand that there's a great many repressive measures in Russia, but of course, many Russians are outside of Russia and are permanently now outside of Russia. And we still don't hear much in the way of any kind of organized forms of protest, or at a bare bones minimum, disassociation from that brutality that is being unleashed in Ukraine today. So I'll just end it there, that to think in more creative terms of assessing the political role of religion currently and going forward.
I think that that's very helpful. And I want to pick up on something from this, Kathy, as we come to our conclusion in just a few minutes. I'm going to go back through the list of our speakers top to bottom. We'll end with Jose. And if you have a last very brief remark to make, And if not, could you tell us, again, thinking about students, thinking about concerned citizens, many of us are here in Washington, D.C., so I think about the young congressional staffer who's looking for news. What is a source? What is a place where someone could go and on a regular basis learn about the types of things that we're hearing about today? These issues are not on CNN. They're not on the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post. Is there some place to get this type of information? We'll start with Archbishop.
Well, there's a number of sources. The Religious Information Service of Ukraine publishes also in English. It has kind of some regular reports. But there is kind of, for those that don't know Slavic languages, it takes a little bit of time. One regular report is made by His Beatitude Sviatoslav Shevchuk on a daily basis. He does a little video where he recounts the day's war events and then does a little theological, spiritual interpretation. That's every day. It's been going on for, I think, 350 days. And it's translated into English, French, Spanish, Italian, I think. So those are some of the sources. What is, I think, very important, I'd like to say at the end, is that at the heart of the global interest in Ukraine is not just the war and not just the kind of carnage that we see at a granular level. There's 20 wars going on. I just looked at the Times today, the suicide bombing in Islamabad is kind of just a little note on the screen page of the New York Times. But the war in Ukraine is almost constantly a front story in the important Western newspapers. And the question is why? Yes, Ukraine is the epicenter of political, diplomatic change. It's affecting agriculture, food supply. The ecology will change, will be affected. Germany's going to go green. Germany's going to, develop a lot of renewable energy. There will be some good consequences from all of this. Of course, the economy has been profoundly affected, energy policy. But I think what is really mesmerizing the world is something that's deeper. It's the heart, it's the spirit. We live in the 21st century when we've deconstructed just about everything. And there's kind of a radical subjectivism. There's your opinion, my opinion, and there's not much truth left. In fact, there's kind of a post-truth approach. There's alternative facts in some media. And what Ukrainians are saying is, no, not so fast, not so fast. There's good and there's absolute evil. There's truth and there's lies. And I'm willing to risk my life for it. I'm not trying to convince you with an argument. I'm ready to shed my blood. And I think behind that, for many, is something that has been at the heart of most civilizations. There's a belief in eternity. There's a belief that my little life, my 150 or 200 pounds, my little chronology, is not the beginning and end of it all. There's something else. There's something transcendent. And that is a sacred moment. That is what people of faith, this is what churches are all about. And whether it's explicit or implicit, whether it's fully conscious or subconscious, I think that there is a statement about what it means to be human being made in Ukraine. a statement that is post-secular, a statement that is post-truth, a proposal that really shocks people. You know, nobody in France is going to shed their life for the European flag, or much less for the tricolors, I think, or even for the tricolors, I should say. So that is a church moment. That is a spiritual moment. That is something that is not on CNN. And I would encourage all observers, students to look closely at what is behind this incredible solidarity. 7 million people in Ukraine are IDPs, and they've been received by somebody. There's nobody on the streets. I came back after 5 trips to Ukraine, to New York, and I suddenly realized there's no street people in Ukraine. I didn't see them, at least. They've been taken in. Incredible solidarity, courage. This is really something that bears some attention, and I think it has a spiritual, an explicitly spiritual kind of factor and motivation at its heart. Let me tell you, when I said that in Davos last week, it was very, very interesting, and probably one of the most secular settings possible. In your Switzerland, Kathy, you know your Switzerland well, and it inspired people because it's true. The heart, we people of faith, we believe that this is not a lifestyle. We believe that this is the truth about what human life is all about. And if we can find the language for it, if we can name what is impressing the world. I mean, never in global history has a war inspired such global solidarity. I mean, it's not universal global solidarity. Only 14% of the human population lives in countries that have sanctioned Russia. But this solidarity is unique. And I believe it is because of a spiritual witness, because it's a question of life and death. Life, death, but also eternity.
Archbishop, thank you very much for those powerful remarks. And we're really coming to the end of this conversation, but to remind us about the human element. This isn't theoretical. We're talking about men and women. We're talking about their spiritual lives. We're talking about the destruction of war. And thank you for recentering us on this central aspect, this central truth. Let me ask the other panelists, first Nadia and Kathy, if they have any brief wrap-up comments, and then we'll go to Frank and close out with Jose.
Thanks. I think that one of the things that this panel has raised is precisely the issues, like canonical issues versus secular state issues. And one of the things that this war has shown is that we as civil society, secular actors might well want to have the kind of vibrant religious pluralism that Ukraine indeed had before the war. There is a difference between canonical approaches to territoriality, which would then be a problem for, let's say, places like Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, et cetera. So that is the implications of Ukraine for world orthodoxy, and one could even argue Catholicism, are something that we explore in a recent book. The link to that is in the chat. But what this panel tried to do, and I think to do very well, was to precisely to ask the question about religious freedom in Ukraine and to encourage Ukraine to continue along the path of religious freedom in Ukraine, as it has managed to do before and that we hope it will continue to do. Thank you.
Just briefly in closing, I would say that this extraordinary solidarity with Ukrainians, I think, has been generated largely thanks to Ukrainians themselves. This is a highly unusual war in that it's really the first internet war. Everybody has a cell phone and they are documenting not just heroic acts of solidarity, but also the most heinous of war crimes as well. So both what the tremendous heights that the human spirit is capable of, as well as the really hideous lows that the human spirit is also capable of demonstrating, have all been documented and shared by Ukrainians. And I think that also in part speaks to the tremendous solidarity that has risen for Ukrainians and what they are confronting. And I think that also speaks to the fact that we are going to be dealing with this war and the aftermath of this war. And I say we, very much of a royal we, all of us, for decades to come, precisely because so many aspects of this war are so highly documented. I guess I would just say to our viewers as a final note, I'm often asked what can be done. I think it's very important for our own elected officials to be aware of the fact that people remain committed to seeing a peaceful resolution after this invasion of Ukraine, and to communicate with their elected officials to voice their concern for the ongoing atrocities in Ukraine, and to repeat on a consistent and repeated basis their commitment to seeing this war end as soon as possible. I think that's a very constructive thing that we all can do.
And then you asked what we could suggest to students. Already they've been sent to a good website on religion. Our Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, has a column, "Do you have a question?" And they do little videos with us. So there are 30 or 40, some of them dealing with religion. As far as what I would advise on it is that students should learn to question, and particularly question their professors. And one of the examples of this is we are now dealing with our great Slavic and European affairs, a big convention we go to, which is now calling about decolonizing the field, basically saying, what did we get wrong? Why didn't we? And it's the war in Ukraine and the Russian invasion that has brought this about, in which many people in Russian studies are for the first time questioning certain concepts of Russian imperialism, how they viewed Russia since 1991. Why didn't they see, like Tony Blair, who didn't take Putin seriously, why they didn't see how serious this was? And of course, it also involves the church, those who study the church. Did they really study carefully enough and get out enough material on what was happening to the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia? But behind this, of course, there's as much that could be questioned about Ukrainian studies as well. But it certainly shows that people fell into preconceived notions about Russia, about Ukraine, about Putin, who Putin was. And all of this has made us remarkably unprepared for the horror of what has happened.
Yeah, and this indeed is not only the soft power of the Russian Orthodox Church, but the soft power of Russian studies in general, the Russian view of the war and of Ukraine. Kathy mentioned that this is an anthropologist. I think we all, the 5 panelists here, are anthropologists of Ukraine, or participant observers of what the transformation of Ukraine in the last 30 years. And we never took the Russian view of Ukraine for granted, the way most of the world took it for granted. And so this is the need to open itself up to questioning things. And as we in the United States and North America are lucky that we had Ukrainians, diasporas, that established of this Ukrainian Studies Center. But throughout Europe, there have been no Ukrainian Studies Center. There were no chairs of Ukrainian studies, and therefore people were even less prepared to understand Ukraine that we are here in the US, where you actually have now important figures coming on public TV and or on TV and presenting the Ukrainian view of things, challenging the Russian view. So in this respect, I think that this is simply coming together and simply expressing, if you wish, what we've experienced, the transformation of Ukrainian society, the potential of Ukrainian society to be a very, very unique society in the future of Europe.
Well, if we had all of our participants together in one room, I'd ask the audience to applaud this truly dynamic and interesting and illuminating presentation that we had today. We don't have everyone together, unfortunately. But let me just say my thanks on behalf of the Religious Freedom Institute and to Jose and the Berkeley Center for convening this important event. The Berkeley Center website has a number of knowledge resources on Ukraine and on this conflict in particular, as we do at RFI. So my thanks go out to each of our panelists, and this concludes today's presentation. Thank you very much.